temperature rises around the world. We've passed 400 parts per million. And so we're no longer at the precipice, everyone. We all need to take in that we're now falling off the precipice and we're heading into an extinction event that is going to shatter our civilizational infrastructure in ways that we probably can't imagine. And so the necessity of understanding more deeply how our species, which has gone renegade, can come back into alignment with the larger planetary ecosystem is literally the most urgent question confronting the human race. And that's what we're going to be discussing today around the term of ecesis, which is how a species aligns itself with the larger ecosystem and finds its niche in a way that is harmonious and increases the species' ability to be abundant and to be interactive with the larger ecology. So that's going to be our theme for today on Humanity Rising. Before we go to our program, however, let us pause, as we always do, and in this crazy world of ours, full of centrifugal forces that are splitting us apart and challenging us in ways that human beings have never been ever challenged. We all have to attain coherence, one way or the other, and the most effective, easiest way to do that is just to become attentive of your own heart. So just take a moment and center your awareness back into your body and place your attention on your heart and see if for the next 90 seconds or so, you can just simply listen to your own heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive at this unbelievably potentiated moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you joining our program today, I want to say that I learned about the term ecesis from Justin Thomas, who's convening our program today. I knew the concept, but I didn't know the word. And I was so fascinated, I invited Justin to convene a program with a colleague on this very important term and awareness at this critical moment. Justin is a plant biologist and taxonomist in the great state of Missouri. and specializes in plant biology and ecology in the central eastern part of the United States. He lectures at the Missouri University of Science and Technology, and has really dedicated his career to understanding this whole notion of how species interact and interrelate with the larger ecosystem in a way that produces abundance. Justin, this session could not be more timely than it is today, with our ecology spinning out of control, because this species of ours, as I said in my introduction, has been going renegade for a sufficiently long period of time that we're about ready to take ourselves out. And your job, my friend, with Tessa this morning is to show us the way back home. So I'm delighted that you both are joining us, and turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim. That's no small task. We'll do our best. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having us here at Humanity Rising. It's a wonderful program. I've been watching it from the beginnings. It's a couple times a week, and it's really been inspirational and helped me get through the day and stay centered and have a positive sort of message to start my day with, where I am at least.
Thank you.
But ecesis is a wonderful term. It's a scientific term, but it's I don't know if it's ironic or just tragic, but it's not used nearly enough or very much in the science of ecology. I dug it up out of a reference that was from the 1930s, but ecesis is essentially the taking the root of ecology, ecos, of home, and applying cis to it, which is the suffix we use for the process of something. And it's literally the process of home, or as I like to phrase it, it's the process of becoming home. You're not coming to something, you're just realizing you are part of something larger than yourself. There's a couple of quotes I have, one from a friend of mine who sent me a while back, that no organism can be healthier and more stable or more peaceful than the environments in which it lives. Is just a good fundamental ecological concept, but it's not really one that we address in the fields of academic ecology. At least we really don't talk about peacefulness and things like that, and certainly not from a holistic standpoint, though that may be getting better. And then also for ecesis, I like there's an excerpt from a T.S. Eliot poem called Little Gidding, and the excerpt is, the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. That feels like the human journey sort of over and over again. We know that indigenous cultures have ecized, taking ecesis into a verb form. You can ecize into a landscape. All organisms do it at some scale, and again, we're all part of a system. We're all we can't ever truly leave it, but there's a consciousness there. There's you can't physically leave the universe per se, but you can consciously check out. And throughout human history, there's been points where humans and other organisms, we're not alone, have kind of checked out. And so bringing the term ecesis or ecesis back into use is a nice first step into helping shape or giving a focus maybe to that consciousness. I want to clear it up a little bit. Ecesis is not just a species weaving itself into a landscape, and this happens through evolutionary and ecological processes, but it's also that system accepting and receiving and changing as well. The system and the species become one by a melding of changing and shaping one to the other. That's awkward at first, especially when evolutionary biologists and anthropologists know that something happened with modern humans. We changed somehow, and we've spread across the globe, and we've kind of gone on an exploitive rampage in a lot of senses. But we're still part of the system, and now we're coming to a point where we're beginning to wonder how we get back into that, or how we could become conscious of what we lost in the interim. Because we're seeing the system change. We've spread so much across the globe. We're now seeing global phenomena as pushback, the pushback we need to start becoming conscious of the fact that we are engaged in something, whether we want to believe it or not. And the more that pressure builds, the more we will ecize. The process of ecesis will be fulfilled. And we'll look at some data and some examples that Tess and I have both prepared for that. And I also want to kind of tackle the second part of the title of the talk, which is the how nature can save humanity. And it's kind of funny that the title itself is a bit paradoxical, that how can nature save humanity, as though they're two things. The solution is, it's quite wonderful that the solution to that is in the understanding that they're not two things, and that the paradox or the riddle is solved by realizing that as T.S. Eliot said, to know the place for the first time, to know that we were always home, we could never not be home, and then to start getting serious about what it means and how we consciously move forward. And as I'll talk in a moment, how we can kind of measure and monitor that. I think that's an important step in this process and in this communication, is to give people some tools to move forward. And so Tess is going to give us a rundown of some ecological concepts and some of the wonderful things we see in nature, and some of the more prescient issues. And then I'll come back and speak a little bit about some data that we collect to the organizations that I work with, and what they ultimately show us, or maybe some paths forward. And Tessa, I'll introduce Tessa a little bit. Tessa is a PhD candidate in Southern California, a field biologist, botanist that I've worked with for years, an amazing and talented observer of nature. And that's what a lot of this is I think, even in the camp of biologists and botanists, there are a lot of us that really sort of look beyond the evidence in front of us and try to find heart and purpose and meaning and direction to what is often just a lot of numbers and figures. Tessa is a wonder at that, and she'll share that with us. Go ahead. Back, send it to you, Tessa.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Justin. And again, Jen, thank you so much for having us on here. This topic is so near and dear to me, and working within the ivory tower of academic ecology, I don't often get to talk about these things in this way. I don't get to bring in the notion of consciousness or love or compassion for entities outside of the human. And so I'm just really grateful and excited to be able to share all of this with you. And,
hey, Tessa,
yeah.
Before you go any further, could you check your sound? Do you have something else playing in the room?
I do not.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I hope I can speak louder if that's helpful.
No. It was just, there's something else going on. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I am sorry in advance, but I wanted to start this conversation in the same kind of mood that Jim introduced this episode today. So this is a stark and sobering image, actually from the wildfire season last year, that I really feel captures the mood of the current crisis that's rapidly unfolding across the planet, and a crisis that is essentially the whole world experiencing these natural disasters of some kind. So the flooding that we've seen in Europe, the wildfires that are raging across California, where I live, and across the Southwest more generally, the extreme temperatures that we're experiencing. I think that it's really easy to kind of unplug and to just say, you know, I don't want to be bothered by this idea of collapse or some kind of you know, apocalyptic kind of notion. But I think that it is incredibly important that we all kind of stay present with the crisis and really keep up with what's going on. And to this image and idea of destruction and collapse, this idea of scarcity and suffering, I want to add the caption that perhaps the most important and pressing topic of our time is that of humanity's relationship to what we call nature, just as Jem was mentioning. The land that I conduct my research on in Southern California is the traditional land of the Cahuilla, and they have no word for nature in their language. So they have no conceptualization of a human species that exists outside of and separate from everything else. And I think that this is pretty instructional for us. And as many have suggested, this conceptual rift between humans and non-humans really lies at the heart of the problems that we face now as our planet undergoes these rapid and pronounced changes. The nature-culture divide has nurtured this widespread notion of humans as exceptional and assuming our position as separate and superior, and therefore continually reinforcing this relationship characterized by domination, subjugation, commodification, and ultimately independence, that we're separate, independent entities. And now we're experiencing ourselves on the other side of this power dynamic where nature is starting to bite back. And so what does this moment require? And the Paris Climate Agreement goals, in order to meet those, we, as everyone probably realizes that's watching this, we have to make drastic reductions in CO2 and methane emissions. And so there's been this flurry of ideas being floated around about, you know, how can we more quickly sequester as much carbon as possible. And while there's a lot of technological innovations that are being pushed, these kind of sci-fi situations of like sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, but ultimately we know that natural carbon sequestration is most effective using plants. And so there have been images like this promoted of you know, humans stepping in to save the planet by planting trees. And it's a beautiful image, it's a beautiful notion, but I wanted to highlight it because these calls for reforesting and tree planting targets, I feel like they really capture our very simplified notion of what nature is and therefore how we can save it. So recent science is telling us that context really matters and nature is really not as simple as we've imagined. So on the surface, these tree planting pledges are beautifully life affirming and positive, but in general, this process of afforestation or reforestation, it often uses these non-native plantation species, which can disrupt the water balance of dry land regions when they're not planted with locally adapted species, such as the case in southwestern China. And a recent article published in Nature did this kind of exposition of the Bonn Challenge, which is this international agreement that was made about 8 years ago with the idea of, you know, planting basically an area slightly larger than India worth of trees. But this report, looking at the fine print, these researchers found that almost half of these areas are set to become plantations of commercial trees. And so these are set to become, for example, in Brazil, which hosts the largest swaths of Amazon rainforest, over 80% of this promised restoration is actually going to be monoculture plantations rather than natural forests. And although these monocultures can support local economies, plantations are much poorer at storing carbon than our natural forests. And the regular harvesting and clearing of plantations releases stored CO2 back into the atmosphere about every 10 to 20 years. while natural forests continue to sequester carbon for many decades. So I think the key point to make here is, how can we know how to fix our situation when we, as an industrialized capitalist culture, perceive nature not only as other, but as this incredibly simplified and homogeneous notion of other? And this is the key question that I think lies at the heart of the larger crisis that we're facing, that's much less talked about, that's looming and interwoven with the climate crisis, and that's the biodiversity crisis and the potential for ecological breakdown. So these images of animals suffering at the expense of this world that we've created are absolutely heart-wrenching. And unfortunately, they don't even come close to conveying the magnitude of this larger crisis. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity, this meeting that was convened of all of these experts, showed that about 75% of the land surface is considered significantly altered. About half of the live coral cover from coral reefs has been lost since the 1870s. The average abundance of native species has fallen at least 20% and has mostly taken place since about 1900. About a quarter of species of animals and plants are threatened, which suggests that around 1 million species are already facing extinction. And the largest contributing factor to these changes has been changes in land and sea use, with about 30% of our terrestrial surface now urban or agriculture. Just kind of let that settle in for a moment. 30% of our terrestrial surface is now urban or agriculture, followed by the direct exploitation of nature. And we know that that's related to our economic system. And because these direct drivers are the results of many underlying causes, which are ultimately underpinned by how we as a society operate in regard to our values and our behaviors, I think it's really worth diving into and rearranging how we think of ourselves, how we think of what we call nature, and what kind of world we want to live in, and how we have to reshape our behaviors to do so. So intact ecosystems undermine essentially every aspect of our lives, either directly or indirectly. Animals of all kinds rely on quality habitat, diverse habitat, pollination, regulation of air quality, water quality, including freshwater, filtration, protection from hazards such as these extreme weather events that we're seeing, energy production, medicine, et cetera, et cetera. We absolutely depend on functioning intact ecosystems. And I think a key question in reflecting how we ended up living in a world with diminishing biodiversity, a polluted atmosphere, out of balance climate, and where the only sizable actions being proposed are to plant these monocultures is, why have we applied such a paradigm of homogeneous entities and actions to this beautiful, wildly heterogeneous world? Why have we treated the astonishing biological diversity on the planet like it didn't matter and like we didn't depend on it? And I'll begin with the idea that until fairly recently, we've had this pretty simplistic notion of how nature works. We know much more than we ever have in regard to Western science, but the field of ecology has been developed within the context of its own social and cultural baggage that has introduced subjective biases. And this very simplistic view of nature has shown up in research as well on biodiversity responses to climate change, which is something that I focus on. So this huge underlying assumption that we've had in the field of ecology was that species are primarily distributed according to climate, and that with increasing warming, these populations of species depicted here with these circles would just shift right on up. As the climate warms, they're just going to track their optimum temperature. And now that climate's rapidly changing, we're gathering data on what species are doing, and we're finding that they're responding in wildly different ways that we're trying to make sense of. Some species that I've shown in my data are shifting downward in elevation, so the opposite from what's expected. There's all kinds of bizarre things that are happening, and I think that the take-home message is that species are not only influenced by their abiotic environment, by climate, soil, etc. But they're also strongly influenced by the ways in which they interact with other species, which often vary in really complex ways. Because species occur as these local populations across these wildly diverse landscapes and are in interaction with a wildly diverse assemblage of other species. They're embedded in their ecosystems. And like the desert habitat where I work, many people think that nothing really lives in deserts, they don't really matter. But there's a staggering amount of biodiversity, even in these seemingly kind of empty ecosystems that people think of. And to use an example, when I started my dissertation research, I had been taught from textbooks and journal articles and studying ecology that competition for resources among plants was the driving force behind all patterns of biodiversity. So plants need sunlight and water, and so all of these different forms must be intensely competing for them and excluding other species. So I started the fieldwork for my project and working in the desert for the first time with these unfamiliar plants. Before then, I had worked with Justin in the Midwest on prairies and forests. And what I saw kind of knocked the breath out of me because I saw the world really differently. I saw plants growing in clumps together, like I'm showing here, with small plants growing up under the protection of larger ones. And not only trees nurturing these smaller plants, but also common succulents like this agave and yucca species, also nursing the establishment and growth of other species. Sometimes even a tree seedling thriving under the protection of a really small cactus. The cactus wren building its nest in a cholla cactus nearby. And in this harsh environment, I was blown away because everywhere I saw cooperation, which went against what I had been taught. And although this potential for mutually beneficial symbiotic cooperation between species was recognized early in the history of biology, ecologists for many years considered this phenomenon to actually be uncommon and even kind of fringe. And so research on ecological interactions have historically focused on antagonistic relationships, such as natural enemies like herbivores and pathogens and competition for resources. And so until very recently, we've had a pretty limited understanding of how important mutualisms are. But this beautiful art by Macrina Bussato depicts the complex interdependencies that are now being illuminated. So this highly evolved, mutually beneficial relationship that you all are probably aware of between fungi and plants is one of the most widespread and ecologically important mutualisms on Earth. So mycorrhizal symbiosis not only helps individual trees access water and nutrients, but they can also influence entire plant communities by enhancing the establishment of these little vulnerable seedlings by incorporating them into their common mycorrhizal network. So we now understand that nature is networked and highly interconnected. And now that we've shifted this lens and started altering how we view nature, we're finding mutualistic interactions are everywhere. So beneficial symbioses between multicellular and single-celled organisms are considered one of the major evolutionary transitions of life. Plants colonize land with the partnership of mutualistic fungi. Humans are born basically sterile before getting bathed in this soup of beneficial microbes, which contribute to their healthy metabolism and brain function and immune stimulation. And we're finally realizing that without beneficial bacterial partners, animals and their complex organ systems might not have evolved at all. So our own human bodies can no longer be seen as these fortresses to defend against microbial invaders, but rather as these nested ecosystems. And the once considered exceptional symbiosis is now recognized as likely the rule of nature. So this has been a pretty recent paradigm shift. But living in this highly mutualistic world means that there are these layers of interdependencies. So pulling one strand from the web means these cascading consequences. So mutualistic interactions can vary in how specific they are. But since these interdependent interactions are so ubiquitous, species loss is a much bigger issue, because now we're not just talking about the loss of a single entity, The loss of a mutualistic partner can threaten species that obligately depend on them, even indirectly. So for example, one of the biggest consequences of warming temperatures is the heating of the oceans, which has large consequences for marine ecosystems. Coral bleaching is basically the breakdown of ecological interdependencies and the loss of mutualism, where these extended periods of heat stress basically lead the coral to expel their endosymbiotic algae by the host. And so the coral and algal mutualist, along with a rich variety of other microbial partners, have this finely tuned resource exchange that just breaks down. And similarly, with the range shifts, we're finding that some plants can not shift to their optimum conditions because they're missing their mutualist, they're missing the soil fungi that they depend on, or they're missing their pollinator species. And so it's now that we stand at the precipice as our world changes at this unprecedented pace that we're really starting to see the reality of life as these layers and layers of interdependencies. And once we begin to see this world of diverse interactions and interdependencies, the question arises of where do we see the entry point for knowing anything about the world of living beings? And this has been a long, ongoing kind of debate between natural scientists. And so reductionism is this philosophical position that basically interprets a complex system as the sum of its parts. So the property of one is not essential to describe the property of the other. And for an ecological system, the reductionist would say that the knowledge of the parts, like an individual species, can tell us everything about the whole, such as the level of the ecological community. So from the perspective of holism, an ecological system can only truly be understood by treating it as this unitary whole with unique properties that cannot be understood by taking it apart. And reductionism has been, as you all probably know, the distinguishing feature of Western science, with the mechanistic materialism of Galileo and Newton and Descartes, who all saw nature as this grand machine comprised of these smaller parts which functioned according to these strict deterministic physical laws. But an alternative to this longstanding dualism between reductionism and holism is that of a dialectical relationship, which views the whole as a contingent structure that is in constant reciprocal interaction with its own parts and with the greater whole of which it is a part. And so I think the important point that I want to make here is that recent ecological literature is showing us the dialectical nature of nature. And to illustrate this idea, I'll use insights from my field of plant community ecology. So if two plants grow close together in the same place, they can either compete for resources or they could help each other, as we're finding out. So if this pair of species live in a stressful environment, they're more likely, according to more recent research, they're more likely to benefit each other by growing close together. And if we move them into environments with plenty of resources, nutrients, then we start to see that relationship shift to more competitive. So this context dependence of interactions is showing to be widespread among many different types of organisms, where the outcome depends on the environmental conditions. But pairs of interacting species don't exist in isolation in the real world. They co-occur with many other organisms, including other species of interacting plants. So for instance, at one end of a spectrum of a resource poor community, there are more types of stress imposed and less phenotypes adapted to those conditions, where the less stressful environment is able to support a more diverse array of species adapted to those conditions. And so an important lesson to emerge here is that as we embed these interacting pairs of species into their larger communities, the outcome of these interacting pairs will change depending on the diversity of the members of that community. So diversity can essentially dilute the intensity of competitive interactions. And while this insight might seem pretty anticlimactic to you, I think that this is extremely important, not just for enhancing our understanding of ecosystems and how we can restore them, but more generally in understanding the embeddedness that all of life unfolds within. So the presence and status of any given species is contingent on the sum of its interactions with the abiotic environment and the environment of other organisms. And these recent insights emerging from ecology suggest that not only are these interactions contextual, but that identity itself is contextual. So species will adjust their physical traits to adapt to their biotic and their abiotic environments over really short timescales, resulting in highly co-adapted ecological systems over longer time. So for instance, once plants establish, they release carbohydrates from their roots, attracting beneficial fungi. They feed particular species of insects and herbivores. They house particular bird and mammal species. Their litter changes the chemical structure of the soil, influences the nutrients moving through the system. Trees respire and they give moisture to the air, influencing the local climate. And so then it's here that we confront this legacy of a mechanistic reductionist perspective, which conceives of the interaction of a species with its environment as entirely unidirectional, where a species reacts to and evolves purely in response to its environment and ignoring the possibility of the alternative. When in reality, organisms are constantly active in constructing their environment through their own life activity. And those changes then modify the natural selection pressures with which other organisms are exposed, which can then trigger evolutionary responses in these other species. And so these tangled webs of influence can start to be understood by seeing the world as being organized through feedback loops. And you've probably heard of feedback loops before. We're currently promoting two very dangerous feedback loops relating to rising global temperatures. One of these is the Amazon rainforest die-off, where rising temperatures increase drought and fire, which are killing trees and leading to ultimately less rainfall. The other is with rising temperatures, melting sea ice and reducing the reflective capacity of the ice, which causes more heat to then be absorbed and further temperature rises to occur. So positive feedback loops amplify a particular effect or change from preconditions and basically cause this cascade of reinforcement. But in addition to being this mechanism that can cause damage, positive feedback loops are the internal engines of ecosystem organization. And so a positive feedback loop is also an autocatalytic cycle, which essentially means a cycle of processes where each constituent process benefits the next one in the sequence to maintain this configuration of the whole. And this universality of circular interaction structures follows from the simple fact that organisms produce resources that are subsequently used by other organisms, which culminate in chains of resource consumer interactions. As an example, the nutritional quality of plants tend to decrease with reduced rainfall, like this juniper tree here in this dryland ecosystem. And the less nutritional leaves of these more stress-tolerant shrubs become less attractive to large herbivores, which means more litter is left to accumulate on the soil and be broken down by animals feeding on the dead material like earthworms, who then increase the infiltration of water by basically tilling the soil, which positively feeds back to promote the growth of the plant. And this is just one example of many that, that power our world. And ecosystems have been referred to as complex adaptive systems because their larger properties, like the patterns of nutrients and biomass flow and diversity, emerge from these local small-scale interactions, where these interaction structures, these autocatalytic cycles, reflect a kind of self-organization. And so we can conceive of nutrient availability and nutrient cycling as emergent properties of the configuration of these interactions. So feedback loops are integrated at higher levels to generate the emergent property of the ecological community, which is the pattern of species interactions. And again, this is a very recent way of perceiving ecological communities. And an ecological network is this representation of species and their interactions that they establish. And behind this conceptual framework is this rich and expanding literature whose primary focus has been to quantify how properties of networks relate to their resistance to disturbance, tolerance to extinction, et cetera. And it's providing a lot of insights into ecological theory. So a network perspective of ecology is enabling all kinds of insights, like how if this network that I'm showing here is compartmentalized, that tells us things about the rate at which extinction will ripple into this cascade of extinctions. But a network perspective of life has, I feel, in particular importance and instructional value for human beings. While humans are just one node in this very complex network of relations with all these other living entities, we have, through our incredible technological innovations, assumed this cosmopolitan role, exerting disproportionate impact on the rest of the network. And so our actions have this outsized role to play in the unfolding of ecological and evolutionary history. So if we could see ourselves and our health and our fate all contingent upon this web of interactions defining life, how might we proceed differently? We live in these bodies of nested ecosystems that compose our notion of individuality, that are actually woven together by all of these cross-species interactions. So what if we lived in a world where we could really recognize our interdependencies? This perspective of dialectical materialism, I feel like, is really helpful because it views the whole as this contingent structure in reciprocal interaction with its own parts. So the whole and part don't completely determine each other. They rely on each other. So the network perspective of life recognizes that we're fundamentally interconnected and interdependent. And scientific understanding is an intellectual endeavor and can change our perspectives, but it's also associated with world-making practices. So practices of knowing and being, as many people have talked about, they can't be isolated, as both of these things contribute to configuring the world in certain ways that are complex and constantly changing. So different ways of knowing the world affects how one acts in the world, and thus our behavior in the world. And also reciprocally, the way one acts in the world affects the way that one understands the world. Knowledge making is intrinsically tied to world making, and it's always connected to these larger structural, political, economic, and social processes. We have long-standing uneven power dynamics involved in knowing and managing nature, including the knowledge, the politics that privilege Western science and marginalize local knowledge and land use practices. So I'm going to end with a quote from the evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin. Both the internal and theoretical needs of ecology and the social demands that it inform our planned interactions with nature require an ecology that makes the understanding of complexity the central problem. It must cope with interdependence and relative autonomy, with similarity and with difference, with the general and the particular, with chance and necessity, with equilibrium and change, with continuity and discontinuity, with contradictory processes. It must become increasingly self-conscious of its own philosophy, and that philosophy will be effective to the extent that it becomes not only materialist, but dialectical. To live in alignment with natural systems, we really need to understand natural systems. And this is why I feel that ecological literacy is very important. But in additionally, to understand natural systems, we must be aware of this subjective lens through which we see the world and through which we make sense of ourselves in the world and in relation to all other living things. We are each separate individuals with our own unique innate attributes, but we are further and perhaps more largely defined by the sum of our contexts, the other people, plants, animals, and microbes we interact with in the environment that we are not only constructing, but that's also constructing and influencing us. So we must embrace our relational selves as our ecological selves. And now I'm going to turn it over to Justin.
Thank you, Tessa. That was nothing short of fantastic. Beautiful. Very well done. I'm going to share my screen now, I think. Whoops. Everybody close your eyes. There we go. Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of pick up from there with Tessa, with that wonderful overview and wonderful demonstrating the wonderful relationships and just how embedded and engaged and involved all living things are with each other, and how necessarily so. And I'm gonna try to dig into the consciousness of that a little bit and use data as we go along with some of the research that I personally work on. But I like to start with the notion that if regenerative cultures are to live in regenerative communities, we must have a regenerative consciousness. And I know this isn't the audience that's surprising or new for by any means. But we also need a way to measure it. And that's kind of what science is supposed to do. It's supposed to be a social construct that gives us feedback on how and why nature, not nature in the separate sense, but nature in the original sense for scientists, was that nature was existence, was everything. The natural phenomenon was everything around us. And then later it was split out and marginalized, and but the original goal still kind of is yet to be fulfilled, at least in a social functioning dynamic. We need to be able to literally measure our conscious involvement in systems and the complexity of those systems, because there's a range of complexity in systems. Just, humans aren't unusual in our ability to separate ourselves from things. Nature does it too. When you simplify nature, you take the consciousness even out of it. So, and we'll get into that with examples, but I want to start with this is a prairie. This is a prairie in Northwest Arkansas. A lot of people don't know prairies exist in Northwest Arkansas, but this is up the Arkansas Valley. These gorgeous intact systems. This one's owned by the Nature Conservancy or managed by it. But when I see places like this and you go to places like this, I always remind myself that the plants are the primary producers, that every beat of my heart, every flap of a bird's wing, every thought that was ever in my head or any head of anything that's ever existed, any insect thoughts, and there are insect thoughts, or any microbe interactions, it's all powered by the sun through photosynthetic organisms like plants. So every space, every place on Earth, every square meter on Earth expresses those plants differently. And that expression is a manifestation of the history of the site and the history of the dynamics and the memories, the shared experiences of those organisms in place over time. This is one such place that has just had long, stable antiquity. These are unglaciated prairies. There's Gulf Coast influences, there's Midwestern influences, there's Southwestern influences. Just as climate is naturally shaped and shifted over thousands of years, these systems have become little Velcro pads of ecizing, the process of ecesis, and pulling species into their engagement and weaving those that can sustain themselves, and buffering. It's funny that like in really high quality intact systems like this that are often dryish communities, there'll be wetland plants growing in them. Those wetland plants that are growing drier than they normally would are supported by the rest of the community through various connections and things. So the more complex, the more welcoming, the more open, the more conscious, I would argue, these systems are, the more stable over long periods of time. This prairie in particular is sort of regionally famous amongst botanists because we collected data here, and 1/4 meter, so a 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter square, which is about, if you don't know meters, 2 feet by 2 feet square, with what we collect data from. We lay down these square frames and we identify the plants in them. That a prairie like this near here had 47 species of plants in a 1/4 meter frame, 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter, which is just amazing. Coexisting. There's bee pollinators, little tiny bee pollinators that they live their entire lives within a 10-meter square, and always have something to nectar upon. There's always something blooming, always something that maintains them. When you impact those systems, these are these fine, in the sense that these systems are highly evolved and connected by fungal hyphae, in the sense that those fungal hyphae are delicate and sensitive tips of evolutionary and conscious branches, or even neural networks. The sense that they're those fragile tips is how fragile they are when it comes to anything that's extreme that can impact them. They're resilient to normal fluctuations, but when something strange and unusual, unnatural happens to them, they don't have the genetic memory, they don't have the institutional memory, the community memory to react to these sort of things. So you get a reduction in the functionality of the systems, and I'd argue a reduction in sort of the consciousness. The sort of purplish flowers there with the long rays is echinacea, a wonderful medicinal plant for a lot of people. Certainly for indigenous cultures, and even utilized in more modern cultures with mixed consequences. Another thing I like to point out when I go to places like this, and I show people places like this, these are thermodynamically stable systems. There's a concept called the thermodynamically stable or ecological thermodynamic stability. And what that basically means is that when you get all these organisms, the niches are so full and everything's using an energy and been shaped by each other in the system and so stratified and structured and fitting together that nothing goes to waste. I mean, the light comes in, it's all being used, it's balanced with the nutrients and the microbes in the soil, and it becomes this thermodynamically just humming along system of functionality. That functionality dramatically reduces entropy. And I don't want to get too crazy into physics, but the time, the arrow of time moves as a matter, and its exhaust, the exhaust of time is entropy. It's the waste of the universe moving forward. These systems literally slow time. And I know it sounds weird, but time is a relative construct. Time is nowhere the same in any one place. Time is different in these places. They're stable, they're slow, they're methodical. There's a different time signature in a place of intact ecological dynamism. Those places, when they become fragmented, like this prairie is only 100 acres or so in a sea of agriculture, when it becomes an anachronistic construct in a landscape, it just takes a pinprick pop of this bubble of time and it can implode, invasive species will move in. So these are very delicate, very sensitive things because they're living in a different time signature. I think that's just a wonderful concept in general, and very backed by science. It's not an unusual concept. One thing I also like to point out, this is a conscious engagement in these systems. I've been using lately actually this rock, paper, scissors analogy. I read a quote that it's just as easy to lose rock, paper, scissors as it is to win. And rock, paper, scissors is the classic game where it's a random, more or less random outcome. And I think that's a good example of the model, the ecological model of competition, where everything's trying to win. And they're I'm going to do rock and I'm going to win, or I'm going to do paper and I'm going to win. But in reality, it's a random configuration. If you do it over and over and over and you keep trying to win, it's always going to be a random outcome. If all three people playing, it's always going to be a random outcome. But if somebody decides they're going to lose every time, if somebody says, I'm going to be paper and I'm always going to be paper, well, eventually the other players will say, oh, that person is always paper. I'm always going to be scissors because I'll always beat them. And then somebody else will always be scissors. And somebody will say, well, I'll always be rock and I'll always beat them. So if you try to lose over repeated time, losing, sacrificing, punting, giving in to the necessity of the larger landscape, being conscious of patterns around you and working around those patterns in a healthful way is how these systems build. And that's a consciousness. There has to be an engagement. There has to be, it may not be the consciousness like we are, but I also don't do a lot of things like other things do. So there's a shaping of systems that is an engagement of systems. And that takes time. And the longer that time, the more games of rock, scissors, paper, the more sacrifice, the more complex and efficient and robust and more conscious systems become. It's why invasive species are often a large problem. They enter the system and they change the rules. And do invasive species ecize? Is there an ecesis process for invasive species? Yes, but it's a very long-term process. And I don't want to get into invasive species too much, but they're working by the same function. But what happens with these large, amazing, complex systems when we impact them is they change. So here's a prairie system that's been overgrazed and it's been burned at the wrong times, too many times. The species that have come out of that, for folks that know plants, the most of the plants in there are sumac, kind of I don't want to use the word weedy. I think weedy is a very derogatory term. Each plant has a place in time and a place as an ecological role that it fulfills. There are species that, and in a given landscape, even in an intact earth, an intact globe, or an intact 100 square miles of just nature banging on all cylinders, somewhere a tree is going to fall in a windstorm and there's going to be a tip-up mound. And that's where these temporary communities, these scab plants that we call them, are pioneer species. They're the rugged, rough and ready, early colonizer species. That's their niche. That's where they find and grow. When you turn an entire community into that through overexploitative practices or just not knowing any better, the system changes. Now all of a sudden you have individuals that are not quite as ordered. The system isn't as ecologically, thermodynamically efficient. There's waste. Time is moving faster. Entropy is being produced. And that's sad on many scales. But one of the beautiful things, I don't want to leave it as a sad memory for the system, is that there's still life there. And that life could still, other things can colonize. And ultimately the beauty of living systems is they can change and they can adapt. And they can always heal, even if it takes evolutionary time. Life will persist. I think we all know that. The goal is to mitigate as little damage to that as we possibly can. We don't want it to come to that, but it is one of the wonderful things about living systems in general. Here's another example, a woodland community. This is in the Ozarks, with grassland dynamics intermixed with woodland dynamics. All the species here, very, very late successional, very deeply embedded and engaged, and have site history, site memory through genetics, or just beyond, other than genetics, epigenetic relationships, if you will. And I would argue a conscious relationship and conscious memories of themselves in place, in time with each other, and all that entails. Conversely, if you impact the logging activity, that changes back to a simplified, less conscious. The species in this, like the last damaged site we saw, they're simple species. They're annuals. They live for a year. They're very fast. They're not weedy. They're transient. They're transitory. They're pioneering. They move in, and they're not really, they don't form. They live for a year. They reproduce. They produce thousands of seeds and scatter them across the landscape. So they're not forming long-term ecological relationships, but they're still a functional element of a system. It's just when they become the dominant part of a system is when problems arise. I kind of sketched out sort of that relationship here, and I'm not going to read all this, and nor do I expect you to read it. But on the left, you've got in red the sort of a modern impacted communities. They're often simplified. They're high nitrogen. The simplified soil microbia. There's transient and generalist species and little predictive value. These are the systems that modern humans tend to create, and that's a reflection of our lack of empathy, our lack of consciousness, our lack of engagement and awareness, our inability to expand the circle of compassion to include these places. And I saw in the chat earlier, people were talking about rewilding and restoration, even ecological restoration. This is it's not new. It's a way that we expand consciousness back into these landscapes and breathe consciousness and realize that, oh, it's almost like bumping into somebody and then not knowing it and saying, oh, I'm sorry, how can I make this right? I'm not trying to excuse some of our activities, but we become more conscious of this the more these things stare us in the face. And the plants that live in these systems have evolved to these dynamics, right? So these damaged dynamics, species that evolved to damage dynamics are often annual. They throw seed for thousands of seeds and long distances, and those seeds bank in the soil and wait for what might be some form of damage in the future. Because historically, systems, pre-modern humans, were not constantly damaged. On the right side here in blue, you have old growth regenerative communities, these more conscious communities that are more involved and more in depth and more conscious and more embedded. More ecesis has taken place over longer periods of time for these systems. The plants that occur in those systems produce fewer seeds, and the seeds don't travel very far, and they don't bank for very long because they haven't had to evolutionarily, because basically you just reproduced yourself in situ where you're growing. One funny thing that happens when you damage a really intact system that's full of rich species assemblages of late successional species, one of the enlightening things that happens is closely related species, if you damage those systems, closely related species will hybridize. And they'll create F1 hybrids that are sterile, more or less, but they can back cross. And there's this functional dynamism that we're starting to know about in evolutionary and systematics and evolutionary taxonomy. That sometimes species are born from damaged systems that then these hybrids form, and then genes can be shared between populations because something has changed the dynamic. They start looking for, there are literally epigenetic controls that make things outcross so they can stir the gene pool. And in systems that are long-term stable, most angiosperms, most flowering plants, tend to prefer asexual reproduction, even if they're just pollinating their own flowers, because there's no need to change. You shake up the system, they start to outcross more and more. The degrees of that are degrees to which there's an impact. We could use things like that to measure our impact. And that's a form of consciousness. As we become aware of those dynamics, we can start to say, oh, we better watch these sort of things. That's how the Ecesis process starts working. That's how we start working ourselves into the system, by just awareness. And this is a successional gradient. This isn't an either or. There's a lot of things in between. And one of the things that I work with a lot is, years ago, some folks developed a system called the floristic quality assessment, where species in a region, and this is used a lot here in the US, we have 37 states now have a floristic quality program. Other nations outside the US have adopted it as well, where you assign a value, just in, it's 0 to 10. And they aren't real numbers, they're a qualitative range. They might as well be color, but they're numbers, so we can do a little bit of math with them. And basically, for things that are very annual, very transient, what people might call weedy, but I don't like that word, very temporary pioneering scab sort of plants, those are 0s, 1s, and 2s. And on the other end, the rare orchid that must have a fungal associate, and only in an acid, a low pH seep somewhere in the Adirondacks and nowhere else in the world, that's a C10. So, and then everything's kind of assigned in between. The numbers individually, it's subjective and don't mean a whole lot. But when we take a community and collect data, what species occur there, and we can average that C value, we get what's called a coefficient of conservatism, how conservative they are about where they grow. I prefer to refer to it as the coefficient of consciousness, how conscious and engaged, how late successional, how in depth. And in all honesty, that's not particularly fair, because in reality, the 1s and 2s are just as conscious. I think it's just on a different time scale. They're faster moving. Bias, the human bias in this is a degree of consciousness that's relative. But here's some examples of this. So in that picture before, the white, fluffy, tall flowering plants, that's a plant called burnweed. It's an annual. It germinates after a nitrogen flush, which is caused by damage, produces thousands of seeds, disperses them great distances, and then the seeds persist in the soil bank. You come back next year, you won't find any of it. It's a one-off sort of thing. It's a classic 0 on the C-value scale. It's the first step of if you consider starting from scratch, this is the first thing that comes into the system. Here's a C-value 2, blackberries. If you know blackberries, like in the US, they're a common thing. And in Europe, European blackberries behave pretty much the same way. Pretty much all blackberries are on that spectrum. They're kind of weedy. They're not the far end of early successional. They're woody. They take a couple of years to get going, but they come up into systems that are redeveloping. And they germinate nitrogen flush, and they persist for a long time, and they have thorns. There's a common theme there with thorns and toxicity and allergens and rashes and tangled vines that are sort of a lot of these early successional species are that way. And for years I was always like, well, it's kind of like they're creating a barrier and saying, under construction, go around, don't mess with this. And I thought, well, that's not very sciencey. But then I thought, well, actually, that's what it takes to live there. I mean, in the way that a cactus has to have thorns to live in a desert, in a damaged landscape, a blackberry has to have thorns to stay there until thorns become unnecessary, in which case the blackberries move on and they're needed somewhere else, and something else will come in to replace them. Things like little bluestem, which is the backbone of at least the tall grass prairies in North America. Little bluestem is a dominance forming species, disperses in the wind. So now we're in a C-value 5. These are species that are sort of the blue collar workforce of an ecological system as it develops. As we move along the successional gradient, it becomes sort of the gradient, and little bluestem's known as a facultative mycorrhizal associate and a facilitator of microbial activity with other forbs in a grassland matrix. And of course, bison, the incarnate manifestation of large grasslands need the grasses, if not little bluestem, things like it. Castelligia coccinea, the prairie paintbrush. Some of you folks may know this plant. It's a large genus across the northern hemisphere, at least. This particular one grows in prairies. It is a C-value 6, and it taps into the roots of little bluestem, which we just saw. It's a saprophyte, they call it a partial parasite or a hemiparasite, but it taps its roots in. It kind of sucks the juices and the sugars out of little bluestem. But little bluestem's getting things from other places too, and it's all these things. Everybody's giving a little bit to make the complexity of the systems. I don't think it's a parasitic relationship in the sense of it's being taken advantage of. There's a relationship there that's worked itself out over time. And then moving up to like a C10 I mentioned earlier, like the orange fringed orchid requires very specific old growth conditions. Many orchids, their seeds don't even have a maternal food source. They don't have the endosperm. They just have an embryo, a little tiny embryo of dust, and they float, and they have to find a place to land in the soil. And if that embryo has to form a fungal symbiont, and that fungal symbiont nurses the plant together. So here's the nursing state of a plant being facilitated, or obligately facilitated, by a completely different species. That's a depth of consciousness and a depth of interaction that we have to realize is out there, and we have to appreciate and respect and honor in many various ways if the ecesis process is to go forward. Research as ritual. A couple of years ago, I spent a lot of time collecting data, very rigid sort of scientific measures. We have our squares, and people are down on the ground, and you write things down, and it's, when you're in a prairie in August and you're pouring sweat and the wind stops blowing, and you're sitting in the vegetation out of the wind, there's a sweat lodge in and of itself, that the visions you have of these environments. This is ritual. This is performing a repeated pattern to gain access to knowledge, to gain information about how how reality is. And I think we don't, that's part of that ecesis concept. We don't see it that way as scientists, but that's what we're doing. And I think if we would just allow ourselves to say, this is ritual, this is ceremony, this is participation, this is more than just collecting numbers of something other than me. This is part of me and what I do. And so when we collect data like what we're doing these pictures, and my children, they're collecting data as well. Collecting giggles is what they're collecting. We find this very interesting relationship that I'm going to kind of wrap up things with, is what we call the floristic integrity curve. And this isn't as sciencey, or hopefully it's not scaring anybody off, but when you take the average C-value, so those numbers that are assigned to species, we find that really intact, the higher end, really old growth systems, they tend to score out at about 4.5 on an average C-value. Because like we said, the most of the species are kind of the blue collar workforce holding the community together. But then on the far end, there's a few species of 7, 8, 9, 10 C-values that tip the scale a little bit. Those are the late successional satellite species that are specific for pollinators. They support more and more embedded interactions. And then on the other end of the spectrum, in a healthy system, there are zeros, ones, and twos. They're there because they need to be. 10% of our blood is platelets. Platelets in our blood do one thing: they form scabs. They don't have a nucleus. They're just simple, they're quick, but you got to have 10%. 9%, you're a hemophiliac. 11%, you're going to have blood clot problems. There's a very distinct balance there in that relationship. But the average to about 4.5 are these late successional, fully actualized systems. Damaged systems are on the lower end. So what we see when we start collecting on that spectrum of damaged from early successional to late successional communities is that the number of species, we'll just say number of species is y-axis. I'll use my cursor. The number of species goes up, so you're getting more and more species from zero. The average C-value goes up, and it hits a point where all of a sudden you start losing diversity. The number of species go down, but the average C-value is going up, which means you're getting more moderates to late successional species, but you're losing the ones you had earlier, the temporary species. This is almost like a different community. It's like the first step in a system. And we'll get into that here in a second. And then it hits a point where then it starts building up into the late successional, the more engaged, the more perennial organisms that have deeper ecological connections to pollinators and things like that. So you get this, and then it levels off, or more or less stops there about 5. What's funny is we get about beyond 5 and it starts going down again. But think of this not so much as a curve, but as waves. This is a moving wave in a system. This is a snapshot of an ecological process over time that is not unusual. It's starting with complex instability, and like Tessa was talking about, when they expected the species on the mountains there to move up in relation to disturbance in the system. What they found was more random and more chaotic. That's a classic example of when you destabilize phenomena, you tend to increase the chaos, the unpredictability, the uncertainty. You lose a conscious awareness of what's going to happen. Ancient, engaged, intact systems are predictable, they're stable. So you know what's going to happen because you're conscious of what happened before. The rules haven't changed. That's the degree to which the consciousness is tied into these landscapes, and why I think this is it's a vegetational expression of a phenomenon that's just fundamental to existence. And we'll see here in a minute. I'm gonna skip through a few things because I'm running late. But a lot of folks know, like, Dunning-Kruger effect is a great example of this. It's when you first know about something, you think you know a lot about it, and then you start to apply that information, and you realize, my expectations were too high. I didn't quite know what I was talking about. And then you fall into the valley of despair and reevaluate. Do I really even know anything? What is knowing? And then you slowly climb back out of that into a state of wisdom, or what Elizabeth Sahtouris talks about, the maturation of a species. Ecesis is that same process. It's a maturation of systems. It's a maturation of species. Even the burnweed, like we talked about a while ago, at some scale, is doing this in and of itself. It's fundamental, I think, to the fabric of existence, at least living existence. Technology follows the same sort of trend. Think of like Bitcoin. Bitcoin comes out, everybody thinks, oh, that's going to be really something big. It crashes as the expectation doesn't quite meet. And there's sort of this disillusioned state. And then slowly it starts kind of creeping back up, and it might actually be something. This is a common trend. And how many people started a project and had all these great ideas on how it's going to work, and then you execute it, and then it just kind of goes flaccid, and then you slowly, okay, let's get real and let's do this right. But you almost have to have that first step, right? That's how ecosystems work as well. You have to restart and then rebuild. That's the sort of consciousness we need to get into. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is another great example that a lot of folks are familiar with this. I've seen it on Humanity Rising a couple of times. But it's a wonderful relationship of just, you know, how the pyramid of understanding and sort of the hierarchy of life. But you could even put this on a early successional, late successional community dynamic. And here's that graph I was showing you a while ago. If you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs and put it on a time scale, you're kind of looking at this. Here's a good way to maybe understand how this integrity flourish. I call it the floristic integrity curve because we see it in vegetation, but it's also, like I said a while ago, how we learn and how we experience and how we grow. That's how we're the same. This is the degree to which we're the same. And so then I've got slides just giving more examples of that. This one with going from selfish independence to compassionate consciousness is a way of thinking about this. Systems or children or wherever you want to start, whatever the starting point of the living thing you want it to be, starts and it grows to a point where it's being supported by something else. And then at a certain point, here's what I like about it. Like an egg hatches and a baby bird grows, and it grows bigger and it grows bigger and it starts getting feathers, and then it has wings. At a certain point, it has to fledge, and it fledges. That's a big drop. It's a big experiential, it's an existential threat, but it's a necessary. It's a moving forward towards stability, though for the individuals it may feel difficult. And then there's another life after that. There's a different, higher life, a more complex, a more stable, a more conscious life. These are the processes that we go through at all stages and for all things, including what's fun, ecological systems. I think that's the underlying wisdom in this. What I wanted to ultimately have as a take home for it is that, sorry, going way back, is that the C value system is a way we can actually measure our own conscious engagement. So, if we want to engage more, if we want to ecize into landscapes better, we need more people to go out and learn the plants in their backyard, the butterflies in their backyard, more nature lovers, more engaging, more evolving. Regenerative consciousness or regenerative agriculture has to also include the regional dynamism of the plantscape. This broadening of engagement, this broadening of awareness. What are the transient species? The woodlot outside of my neighborhood, is it on the left side or is it on the right side? We can pinpoint that with a number, and then you can start working on it, restoring that community and learning about it and becoming conscious of it, and that number will change, but the number inside your heart will also change, your experience with it. This is how we're engaging in these landscapes. This is how indigenous people engage with these systems. They work with it, they see it, they feel it, they experience it. They become in contact with it physically. That's what we lack as the modern humans, I think, is the physicality and a way to do it for a reason. Here's a reason. We can monitor ourselves, we can monitor our consciousness by monitoring and understanding the organisms around us. And so few touch-up notes here is how do we save humanity? We fully internalized nature and humanity are not two different things. That's hard to internalize. I even struggle with it, as I'm sure many of you do. It sounds simple, but you start realizing how much of that is tangled its way inside of your every thought. Number two, extending the circle of compassion to include all living things. That's big. You have to We have to accept that a beetle and a blade of grass are as conscious and as alive as we are, and it has as much rights to exist as we do, and start understanding those relationships. And then also start understanding that, well, we eat these things and we need places to live, but that's the sacrificing and sharing dynamic comes in. We don't have to live in a little box and never touch anything ever again. We just have to understand that we give, and that other things give, but we also have to give, and finding that balance, finding that conscious engagement. 3, measuring our successful embeddedness. Like I mentioned, with average C values, knowing the species in a landscape, we can say, oh, okay, we're going to take this watershed and we're going to make this watershed C value go up. We can monitor, and people in the community is going to help, but we're all going to get engaged, and it's going to be great ideas. And then when we start to apply it, we're going to learn this, not it's quite as easy as it was. And then we're going to start becoming conscious of what it really means to be embedded, to be conscious, to be what ecesis means in that situation. And 4, ultimately, how can nature save humanity? It can't not. Living systems self-correct eventually. It's embedded into the fabric of living existence. It's really a matter of just mitigating the damage until we realize that and can see it actualized in a landscape. And I'm going to stop there. And Tessa, do you have anything you'd like to add or to that? Or?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. That was pretty perfect. I love someone asked in the Q&A, what are some kind of actionable steps, and you've done a beautiful job of laying those out. But I love this quote that you just had. I actually just wrote it down, that plants are the crux of bioregionalism. And I love that concept, and it really promotes this idea of, using ecological indicators, using plants as ecological indicators. And so, yeah, I guess whoever asked that in the Q&A, that, just reattuning yourself to your local surroundings. We all inhabit a place, and really just embedding yourself in that sense of place requires intimate experience with those other beings. What are the other beings around you? I was taking a walk in my neighborhood here in Southern California, roasting in the afternoon sun, and just kind of feeling the heat around my skin. And I was just really, looking at the palms and all the planted landscapes, and those are part of my bioregion as well. It doesn't, just because, like Justin is saying, there's no real, there's not really a value that we're assigning. It's not necessarily good or bad. It's just the accumulation of information over time that results in more stable systems. So even going out and, seeing, the planted horticultural species around you and learning those, I think that's also part of this bioregional perspective that's really necessary. I guess that's all I want to say right now.
It's funny how when I do work days at the CSA, the organic farmer up the road from me, and when he and I get together, we're talking ecology. He's talking about it in his garden, and I'm talking about it in just the greater landscape. And it's beautiful that they're the same dynamic, and that he sees it that way. And I think that's how many organic farmers do see it. They're trying to build soil and build diversity and find more stable ways to make agriculture. That these are lines of evidence, or these are lines of information that we ultimately need if ecesis is going to become a human phenomenon, at least in our consciousness. It is anyway, but at least we could be conscious of it. And I think when we become conscious of it, we speed the process up. I think we're at that point, the perch of that fledgling bird, where we're feeling our wings. I thought one time, it's well, we have to assume what we feel our wings are wings, and we have to jump. And that's what a fledgling bird jumping out of a nest has to do, is to say, I think I have all this history of living systems behind me. I've never tested this. I don't know if I can do it, but you gotta go for it. I think a lot of these conversations, Humanity Rising, certainly facilitates this consciousness is growing. And I'm really encouraged by that.
And someone in the chat I saw just responded and said, do we have the time? And that's also a critical point to make, is I think that part of adopting this, perspective of bioregionalism and a sense of local place, we also have to expand that and be aware of, the particular, local, and the global, the whole, and how those are interacting. And yeah, with the situation that we're in, I think that it's so critical that we maintain that lens of reality, which is that things are breaking down, and we do need a sense of urgency very much.
There's a dialectical, you mentioned the dialectical relationship. There's a dialectic to that as well, in the sense that, yeah, it's urgent and we have to do things. But at the same time, humans are not unlike a meteor impact at this point. And there's been a lot of damage. A lot of systems are starting over. A lot of this is going to be, when you create chaos, the way you come out of chaos is through time and experience. And so a lot of this, it will all eventually rebuild, and the world will be more complex and more elaborate and more naturific. I just invented a word, naturific, than it ever was before. That's not an excuse. I mean, we have to look within our time frames and feel within our own consciousness is how we can change those sort of things from happening. But at the same time, you got to say, damage has been done. We can't do much about it. We got to just move forward and try to mitigate the damage and be as conscious as we can looking forward. And I used to, like the prairies of the Midwest, which I love, were plowed long ago. And I used to curse the people that plowed those prairies, but they didn't know, they were just people farming. And, you can't hold the relativity of one time against the other, I think. But what we can do is move forward with a better consciousness and try to encourage that. That's the only way it's going to get better. So I don't know if running out of time is really a thing. It's going to be what it is, but I think we just got to feel in our hearts how to expedite the process.
Yeah.
I saw how can people contact us? I've got I work through an organization called Nature Site, you can find it on the website. It's there somewhere.
Well, Justin and Tessa, this has been a tour de force, my friends. Thank you so much. I think this has been one of the most informative sessions we've ever had on Humanity Rising. So I really want to thank you. Both of you have encyclopedic command of this material. And I'm not sure where to start. But I just got quick comments of appreciation. One is, I love that notion of the elasticity of time.
Yeah.
That's embedded in the ecosystem.
Yeah, it really is.
And that slide that you put up showing that, where there's short time frames, the whole ecology is based on a different logic than when there's a long time frame where complexity and interactivity and specialization can really flourish because there's time.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's time.
Yeah.
And I have just one question, and I know we're pushing beyond the pale here, Rick, but just I was struck by this notion of that, kind of in the end, the ecosystem is going to work it all out. But I'm also, I wanted to ask you the following, because David Suzuki, the Canadian environmentalist, says that in the history of the planet, that 95% of all the species have gone extinct one way or another.
Yeah.
My surmise around that is that extinction is therefore the norm, and that actually it's challenging for species to continue the process of adapting into an ever-changing environment. And what I was getting from you is sort of the reverse, that that if the species just kind of relaxes into this and goes with the flow, as it were, that it's all going to kind of work out. How do you square Suzuki's assertion? May not be true. I assumed it was, given the source.
I think that I wouldn't accuse Suzuki of reductionist thinking by any stretch of the imagination, but there's kind of a bit of that in there, in the sense that 95% of species have gone extinct, but most of them have evolved into something else. And there, I mean, meteor impacts have created large extinction patterns, but life then respeciates. There are the niches. It's almost as though life, in the way that a bat evolves wings and a bird evolves wings, there are constraints within the fabric of whatever is underpinning reality is shaping these things to be what they are. And you know, we're embedded so much, not only into the natural, into the whole world, but the world's embedded into something bigger that is also interacting with these relationships. So I think ultimately, the system is self-correcting. And I think the degrees to which we feel that pressure and we feel the tragedy in the world is our closeness to it. But bad things happen. Meteors happen, chaos happens. That's one of the things Tess sort of talk about, that there's that 0 to 10 scale, and it's not a quality scale. It's not this is better than that. It's that the chaos is always going to happen. So we don't have to make room for chaos. We didn't make room for the good things that are going to happen, and then chaos is just going to happen anyway. Maybe that's the way that I justify it from an existential standpoint. I don't know if that helps. But.
Yeah. No, it's very, very helpful. Tessa, what would be your comment?
Yeah, I think that my comment would be in studying ecological and evolutionary history, that when extinctions happen, it creates this myriad opportunities for increasing diversity. And so now we realize all these radiations of these major plant lineages have occurred through, yes, cooperation, but also by new niches opening up. And so we didn't actually get into kind of, defining what a niche is, and I'll take it for granted that we all kind of get in general what that means, but ecological opportunity and the opening up of niche space has led to all the diversity that we see today. And so it's really from our perspective of, I hope to have a family, and I want my kids to know these beautiful intact systems that I've been able to experience. It's really from our perspective, from the perspective of our species, that we really need to take these actionable steps to avoid our own extinction, including the threat of nuclear war. But nature will find ways to self-correct, as Justin was saying. It will find new ways to innovate, and maybe once humans are gone, squirrels or termites might take over and then become dominant across the planet. But the whole idea is that nature does find a way. We just need to learn to integrate with that web.
That's beautiful. We have a squirrel around the house here, and we call her Miss Red. And she's very friendly, and she tells us when she's hungry. And if we don't pay attention, she'll come right outside my window and just stare at me. Until I pay attention to her, and whatever's going on, I very obediently get up and go.
Your consciousness and the squirrels have been united.
Well, this is so important, just to take another moment on it, because what's been energizing me and the staff over the last couple of weeks is this Arctic News report on the fact that we've now hit 2 degrees centigrade and we're past 400 parts per million. And that's the triggering for basically spin out. And they're now saying that probably by 2026, we're going to experience what they're calling an extinction event, a major ecological chaos event that's going to take out, millions at a minimum and start the process of radical sort of positioning. And one of the major factors of which, as you pointed out, Tessa, is now the massive releases of methane that are coming out of the oceans and out of the permafrost. So we're retooling as a university for what does it mean that, in about 48, 72 months, we could have an extinction event on planet Earth that would make the pandemic look like a cakewalk. Because as the temperatures soar and the CO2 and the methane get out there, we're triggering absolute chaos. So that's why I was wanting to ask you about, this relationship between a generative ecology, a consciously adaptive ecology, but these massive statistics on extinctions. Yeah. So that we can't assume that just because we're here, we're going to be here forever. We've got to make the assumption, as you're pointing out, that it's the responsibility of the individual species to continually probe and understand the dynamics that are being played out in the larger ecosystem. Yeah. And it's the capacity to do that, like the cockroach and some of these species that have been around for, like billions of years. Yeah. They've figured out, whether it's a meteor, whether it's an ice age, whatever's going on. But we've become like the orchid. We've become so finely tuned in our technological arrogance, and I would say, that as we just saw through the pandemic, it doesn't take much to destabilize everything that we've built, thinking that we didn't have to pay any attention. Yeah. So anyway, I just love your last comments. Take a minute each. Tessa, you start, and then Justin, just reflect on what I just said and anything else you want to leave us with, because this is such an important subject, the subject of ecesis.
Yeah, I guess, to respond to what you just said, and thank you so much for, elaborating on that and really driving back home this idea that, we're definitely in crisis mode. And so I think the key thing here is, how do we hold that crisis in our minds and in our hearts, and how do we express and really deeply feel grief while taking actionable steps? But we can do both at the same time, and we must do both at the same time. And while I think, changing our mindset, changing our perspective is of utmost importance, I also feel very strongly that our global leaders need to take more actionable steps. And I think the most powerful thing we can do right now is to put pressure on people in power. So that's what I want to end with.
Thank you so much. Beautiful. Thank you. Justin.
Absolutely, Tessa. That's spot on. I'm going to go back a second and maybe cast a ray of sunshine kind of on the whole extinction sort of thing. Is that right before the mass extinctions in history, like before, the world was dominated by pine trees and giant club mosses before flowering plants took over. Right before that, flowering plants were just small herbs diversifying under a forest of this dominant thing. And they were doing things ecologically better and more efficient. And they were diversifying in the shadow of trees. And mammals, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, were scurrying around, but diversifying and becoming clever and learning how to live around dinosaurs. And then these impacts happen, and that diversity that had to struggle in the shadows was lifted and became the new norm. And so I think that's what we need to do, is things like this, where we're like you're saying, start setting up systems of survival and ways to creatively and consciously embed ourselves and work around for just that sort of event, so that we are ready when things happen. And if we're in the right mindset and we do things more real, they'll be the best way forward.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Tessa. This has been a splendid session. I'm deeply grateful, and I'm inspired. We are thinking about this, and I want to invite both of you to maybe join the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box if you have the time and inclination. And then tomorrow, everyone, we're gonna keep on this question of ecesis. Because in the aftermath of the Arctic news piece and thinking about the data around climate change, we're launching through Humanity Rising with all of our partners. We're now at more than 400 organizations that have joined Humanity Rising. We have scores of organizations that are coming together around our new Masters in Regenerative Action and our BA on Global Skills and Regeneration. And we're launching the Global Regeneration Corps in the spirit of John Kennedy's Peace Corps that he launched back in the 1960s, that really put people on the front lines of working for peace around the world. We want to create pods of first responders, what we're calling regeneration first responders. And we're putting together resources, both in terms of content, in terms of training, in terms of investment, at a fairly significant level, because we've got to take seriously the challenge of ecesis in the immediate future. And it's my hope, Justin and Tessa, that you could both somehow be part of this, contributing content, helping us organize little groups of first responders. But tomorrow, everyone, we're going to be bringing in Ed Muller from the University of International Cooperation, Joel Carboni from Green Project Management, a number of people, Marilyn Hamilton from Integral Cities Networks, and a number of people representing bioregions. We have over 100 bioregions that are coming together around our Global Regeneration Corps. So there's a pretty massive movement to take seriously what Tessa and Justin have just shared. It's not like this information is hiding in the bushes. It's staring us in the face. And I say, we're just not looking in the right direction. So you've enabled us to see the obvious today, my friends, and I'm very deeply grateful, and thank you. And we'll see everyone here again tomorrow, same time, same station on Humanity Rising, as we contemplate as deeply as we can how humanity must rise to face the most obvious fact in the world. And that is, we're about ready to destroy ourselves because we're not paying attention to the most central fact in the world. And that is, we are nature. Full stop. We are nature. So Justin, Tessa, it's always good to be reminded of the obvious.
It is.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. We'll see you here again tomorrow. Bye for now.